Hello and welcome to the lab version of joints. So in lecture we talked about joints and how you could classify joints. Remember there are two ways to classify joints. One is an anatomical classification. And when you use that classification you get three different types of joints: fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. There's also, though, a physiological classification, which remember is based on movement. And we have synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, and diarthrotic joints. Remember that all joints can be classified both ways. If we look at a flow chart, this is what it looks like. Your book uses the anatomical classification system, and that's what we're going to use. So if we look at the anatomical classification system, remember there are fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. Let's look at the fibrous joints. There are sutures, gomphoses, and syndesmoses. Sutures are the joints found between the bones of the skull. In adults, those bones are grown tightly together and they're synarthrotic. But if you look in a fetus or an infant, the bones have not yet grown together, and so there's a tiny bit of movement, and so they're amphiarthrotic. Syndesmoses joints are found between two parallel long bones. So in this example, we see the tibia and the fibula, and you can see the interosseous membrane of the leg there. That is a syndesmosis joint. If we look on our models, we can see the same thing. So here is the tibia and the fibula and the foot, and right there is a syndesmosis joint. The same thing is true on the hand. If we look at it, we can see the radius and the ulna and the hand, and between the radius and the ulna, right there, is a syndesmosis joint. Another fibrous joint is a gomphosis joint. And a gomphosis joint happens between tooth and bone. And if you look at this, you can see tiny little fibers that are holding the bones in place. And so it's a fibrous joint. Let's look at cartilaginous joints. There are two types of cartilaginous joints. There are synchondroses and symphyses. And the type of cartilage that is found here is what determines the type of joint. A synchondrosis has hyaline cartilage, and a symphysis has fibrous cartilage. So if we look at a synchondrosis, we can see this hyaline cartilage. And the best example of this is the epiphyseal plates of long bones. Here you can see it in a diagram, also in an X-ray. Another place you can find a synchondrosis joint is between the ribs and the sternum. Remember, that is hyaline cartilage. A symphysis joint, on the other hand, uses fibrous cartilage. And the best example of this is the intervertebral discs that are found between the vertebrae of the spine. Another place you can find a joint like this is between the two pubic bones. And so we have the pubic symphysis. Another type of joints using the anatomical classification is synovial joints. Synovial joints are all diarthrotic, and so when we look at them, there are six types. We have gliding, we have rotation or pivot, we have hinge, we have condyloid or ellipsoidal, and we have ball and socket and saddle joints. And here's what they look like. And if you remember from lecture, what determines the joint is the shape of the bones at the joint. This also determines the type of movements you can get at each joint. If we look at plane joints or gliding joints, the bones where they meet are flat, flat on flat. And the movement you get is sort of a sliding or a gliding movement. If you look at a hinge joint, it's kind of a cylinder in a trough. And the movement you get is kind of a swinging movement. If you look at a ball and socket joint, it looks like a ball and a cup. And you get lots and lots of movements associated with ball and socket joints. They are the only multi-axial joints in the body. If we look at a saddle joint, it looks a little bit like a person sitting in a saddle. The only place you can find a saddle joint in the body is where the thumb attaches to the carpals. Another type of joint, pivot joints. And pivot joints have sort of a cylinder and a sleeve. And what we get is a spinning kind of motion. It spins to the left, it spins to the right. And then the last type of joint are called condyloid or ellipsoidal joints. In this type of joint, you have a oval convex fitting into an oval concave. You get movements in two directions, but one direction is bigger than the other. So if we look at the model, we can see some examples of these joints. We already talked about the syndesmosis joint, but the joint between the tibia and the fibula and the top of the foot, the talus, is a hinge joint. We also have hinge joints between the phalanges. And then where the phalanges join onto the foot is a condyloid joint. We have gliding joints between the tarsals. If you look in the hand, it's very similar. We already talked about the syndesmosis joint, but at the wrist, there's a condyloid joint. So your wrist can bend in both directions, but one direction is bigger than the other. We also have a saddle joint, which we don't see anywhere else except here in the body. We have gliding joints between the carpals. We have condyloid joints between the phalanges and the metacarpals. And then inside the phalanges, we have hinge joints. We're going to look at a few joints in specific. One of these is the elbow, another one is the shoulder, and then the hip and the knee. But first, let's look at the types of joints we have. If you look at the elbow, we already talked about the syndesmosis joint down here, but there are other joints here as well. There's a joint right here, which is between the ulna and the humerus, and that's a hinge joint. But there's also a joint between the radius and the ulna, and that is a rotational or pivot joint. So at the elbow are two types of joints, hinge and rotational. If you look at the knee is also a hinge joint. And so we have hinge joints here. If you look at the hip is a ball and socket joint. So remember, the head of the femur has a ball on it, and the Alice coxa has an acetabulum, and they fit together. The shoulder is also a ball and socket joint. Also at the shoulder, between the clavicle and the scapula, are gliding joints. Well, remember, some things are found in all of these joints, and some things are found in just a few of them. But one of the things that all synovial joints have is they have ligaments. And so we're going to name ligaments. Well, ligaments are very easy to name if you know the names of the bone parts, because they're just named for what is connected to what. Now we have to decide which bone part is going to come first in the name and which one is going to come last. The one that comes first is the more stable, larger part. The one that comes last is where we see movement, the smaller, more movable part. So if we look at this, we should remember these bone part names. And so hopefully you can do this before I show you the answers. But here they are. 1 is a clavicle, 2 is a coracoid process, 3 is the humerus, 4 is the glenoid cavity, and 5 is the scapula. Well, there are ligaments that attach these bone parts. And if you look, you can see how these ligaments fit together. Well, if you remember, we're just going to name the ligaments from the bone parts, and we're going to choose the more stable bone part first. And so if you look at the first one up there, it's between the acromion and the clavicle. Well, of the two, the clavicle is more movable, and so we're going to use that in the second part of the name. And that's true all the way through here. So let's see if you can name these ligaments. So if you name the blue ligament, it's between the acromion and clavicle. If you name the bright red ligament, it's between the coracoid and the clavicle. And if you name the rusty red one, it's between the glenoid cavity and the humerus. And so what we're going to do is combine those together to come up with the names. Again, remember, the more stable part, the one that doesn't really move, is going to come first. And so if you chose acromioclavicular, you're right. The clavicle is more movable than the acromion. If you chose coracoclavicular, again, the coracoid is less movable and the clavicle is more movable. And then if you chose glenohumeral, gleno is more stable and the humerus moves. So now that you know how to name ligaments, we're going to look at some specific joints. And so again, we're going to look at the hip, the shoulder, the knee, and the elbow. So here are a few ligaments, and we already named these as well. So if you look at this is the shoulder joint, and you can see these ligaments. Well, first you have to find the bone parts and name the bone parts. Once you do, though, it's easy. So look, this runs from the glenoid cavity to the humerus. The glenoid cavity is more stable, and so it comes first in the name. So it's a glenohumeral ligament, but there are actually two glenohumeral ligaments. There's one up at the top, that's the superior, and there's one down at the bottom, that's the inferior. We also have this one, which is between the clavicle and the acromion. We already named that one. And between the coracoid and the acromion, we already named that one as well. This is not a ligament. This is a tendon, and it goes to the biceps muscle. So if we look at it here, we should be able to figure out these ligaments. The same thing is true at the hip. So again, we need to learn or know or remember the bone parts first. Remember, the coxal bone is composed of three bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And they attach to the femur. Well, the femur is the more movable, no matter what we're talking about. And so if it runs from the ilium to the femur, we're going to call it iliofemoral. If it runs from the pubis to the femur, we're going to call it pubofemoral. If it runs from the ischium to the femur, we're going to call it ischiofemoral. And so identify all the bone parts before you start. And then there is the iliofemoral. It's a V-shaped ligament. It's actually sort of split into two parts, but it's still a single ligament. This is the pubofemoral. In order to see the ischiofemoral, we would have to turn it around. And so again, this is anterior, that's our iliofemoral. There's our pubofemoral, and then here's posterior, there's our ischiofemoral. If we look at the elbow, it's a little bit different. And this is because there are two bones. There's a medial bone and a lateral bone. The medial bone is the ulna, and the lateral bone is the radius. And there are ligaments that are on each side running to those bones. Well, when their bones are on each side, remember the word for toward the side is lateral, but they're on each side of the bone, so they're called collateral. And so we have two collateral ligaments, one on the radius side and one on the ulna side. And so we have a radial collateral and we have an ulnar collateral. You can also see the biceps tendon from the other direction in this picture. There's one more ligament though, and this ligament holds the head of the radius against the ulna. It makes a ring around the head of the radius. And one of the words for ring is annulus, and so it's called the annular ligament. If we look at the knee also has these two bones in the lower leg. We have the tibia and we have the fibula. The tibia is on the medial side, the fibula is on the lateral side. And so we're going to have, again, collateral ligaments. The one on the tibia side is called the tibial collateral. The one on the fibula side is called the fibular collateral. We also have some other ligaments associated with the knee. There are two ligaments inside the capsule, and they cross. And the word for cross, like crucify, is cruciate. And so there's one in the front, that's the anterior cruciate ligament, and there's one in the back, that's the posterior cruciate ligament. There's also a ligament that attaches the kneecap to the tibia, and that ligament is called the patellar ligament. So if we look at the knee, it looks like this. And remember, inside here is the patella. So this part is not a ligament because it runs from a bone up to a muscle. So this part is the quadriceps tendon. But this part does run from bone to bone, and so it's a ligament. This part is the patellar ligament. We also have these collateral ligaments. And so this one's on the tibia side, that's the tibial collateral. This one's on the fibular side, the fibular collateral. If we open up the knee and look inside it, we can see those that cross. And remember, in the front, it's called the anterior. In the back, it's called the posterior. We can also see pads in here. These pads are made out of fibrocartilage, and they're called menisci. So there's one on the medial side, that's the medial meniscus. And there's one on the lateral side, that's the lateral meniscus. And then we can see these cruciate ligaments. So here is the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament. And here is the PCL, the posterior cruciate ligament. So the knee, which is the largest joint in the body and the most complex, has the most ligaments and the most other structures. Remember, the whole point of having joints is to produce movements. We went over the movements in lecture, but we're going to cover them again here. And this picture shows the movements that you can get at all of these joints. And remember, it's the shapes of the bones at the joint that determines the movements. So if you look at a plane joint, remember it's flat on flat, and the bones just slide around on each other. If it's a hinge joint, it's a cylinder and a trough, and we get this swinging back and forth kind of movement. If it's a condylar joint, remember we have oval. We have an oval convex fitting into an oval concave. And you get movements in more than one direction. But one direction gives you larger movements than the other one does. If it's a pivot joint, it's sort of a cone shape in a sleeve. And that pivot spins, it rotates. If it's a ball and socket joint, it's a ball in a cup, and you get all sorts of movements. These are the most movable joints in the body. And then finally, the saddle joint looks like a man sitting on a saddle. It gives you similar movements to condylar joints, but the movements are bigger and they're equal in both directions. So if we look at some of these movements, we have gliding movements. This happens between flat surfaces, and they slide around on each other. We also have angular movements, and we talked about these in lecture as well, but if you decrease the angle at a joint, it's called flexion. If you increase the angle at a joint up to 180 degrees, it's called extension. But if you go past 180 degrees, it's hyperextension. And so you can see what happens during flexion and extension. You can do flexion extension with lots of body parts, including the torso and the neck. When you move parts away laterally, though, we don't use flexion and extension. We use abduction and adduction. Remember, abduct means to take away, so it's moving away from the large mass, whereas adduction means adding to, so we're adding to the large mass. So you can see this at the shoulder and you can see it at the hip. Rotation is when a bone spins on its own axis. And so look, rotation spins back and forth. And it's easy to think about that if you shake your head no. But you can also rotate the arms, you can rotate the torso, you can rotate the legs. Another type of circular movement is not rotation, but circumduction. And circumduction is like doing windmills with your arms. One end is wider than the other. Their circumduction is always cone-shaped. We also talked about some special movements. And remember, one of the special movements we talked about could only be done with the hands. And this was supination and pronation. And as I said before, an easy way to remember this is if you supinate, you can hold soup in your hand. If you pronate, you will pour it out. So supination is the palm up or anterior. Pronation is the palm down or posterior. If you notice, when the hand is supinated, the arm is in anatomical position. Another movement we can only do with our hands is we can touch our thumb to our fingers. We have opposable thumbs, and the movement is called opposition. There are some movements we can only do with our feet. We can dorsiflex and plantar flex, and we can do inversion and eversion. So if you look at this, you can see inversion and eversion. Inversion, turning the foot inwards. Eversion, turning the foot outwards. We can also move body parts forward and backward. Forward is protraction. Backwards is retraction. And we can move body parts up and down. Up is elevation. Down is depression. So what I'd like for you to do is try to figure out what all these movements are. Practice them. Now when you look at this, remember the dotted line and the arrow is going to tell you where it came from. The solid line and the arrow is going to tell you what it ended up as. So number 1 starts out standing straight and then moves the leg to the right, and so on. Number 2 starts out with the leg to the right and moves it to the center. So you should be able to look at this and figure it out. So that's the lab on joints.